Good evening and welcome to the Fayetteville Public Library. Welcome also to our viewers watching on the live stream. Before I introduce today's speakers, please remember to fill out a feedback form available at the back of the room or on your chairs. Your feedback helps us plan future events like this one. For those online, your program evaluation form is available on our website under the Events tab. Today's panel discussion is part of Your Mind and Health series being presented by the University of Arkansas Department of Psychological Sciences. Each program is recorded and can be viewed on the library's YouTube channel. Our next program in this series is Under Pressure, How Stress Shapes Decisions on April 27th. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to our host. Thank you.
Hey everyone, there's some familiar faces out there and a few new ones. Thanks so much for joining us. This is our latest installment of the Your Mind and Health series, and this talk is titled Psychological Science in Action. So in science, conferences are one of the main ways in which scientific information is spread. So today we have modeled our talk like an academic conference to give you a sneak peek into what happens in psychological research. So today we'll have three speakers who will share with us their research and answer questions about their work. And at the end of each talk, we would love for you to ask some questions. So this could be about some of the methods they use, some parts that were confusing, how their findings apply to the real world, or anything in between. So at the end of the talk, we'll ask you to come up to the mic in the middle here. And if you have a question, just kind of line up behind the mic. And so now we'll get on with our show. So our first speaker is Veronica Floyd. Veronica is a fourth-year clinical psychology doctoral student at the University of Arkansas. She's interested in the implementation and dissemination of behavioral sleep medicine interventions and how these treatments can be adapted to make them more accessible for diverse populations. Veronica is also interested in understanding sleep health in groups that are often at more risk or vulnerable for sleep health disparities. So please join me in welcoming Veronica.
All right. Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about a study that I ran titled A Mobile Application Intervention for Insomnia Among College Students. So just a little bit of background here. Oftentimes when students are transitioning into college life, they're suddenly in charge of their own daily schedules and needing to manage their own stress. And what can result from this is that some students may begin to engage in some unhealthy sleep behaviors. So this could mean things like going to bed at different times every night, sleeping in on the weekends. And so it's sort of estimated right now that the prevalence of insomnia among college students is about 18%. And when we say insomnia, we're talking about things like difficulty falling asleep, difficulty staying asleep, and waking up earlier than intended. And insomnia symptoms can impact students' physical and mental health, as well as their academic performance. We do have treatment for insomnia. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia is considered sort of the gold standard treatment. A typical course of CBTI requires about 6 to 12 treatment sessions with a trained clinician. There are some limitations that could get in that college students could experience that could get in the way of them being able to access CBTI. So the first is access to a provider. So typically when a student is experiencing some type of sleep problem, they go to see their primary care doctor or their family physician. And these providers don't have a whole lot of background in behavioral sleep medicine, and they typically rely on hypnotic medication to treat poor sleep, or oftentimes sleep in and of itself might just be overlooked during these visits with their provider. CBTI can be time intensive. If we're talking 12 treatment sessions, that could be 12 weeks of therapy. And students are really busy. They have jobs, school, busy social lives. CBTI can be cost prohibitive. So oftentimes students may not be enrolled in some type of health insurance plan, or copays can be really expensive. And then CBTI is often seen as like the treatment that's reserved for really problematic insomnia. So people who have experienced insomnia for a really long time or their symptoms are very severe, then that's kind of when somebody's like, hey, maybe CBTI would be an effective treatment, even though research has shown us that CBTI can be effective for more acute or lesser insomnia symptoms. So we do have a promising and cost-effective alternative to traditional CBTI, which is digital CBTI. Today we're going to be talking about sort of the mobile version of this intervention, so an app-based intervention. And I was really interested in seeing if we could increase the accessibility of this behavioral intervention for sleep among those that are often missed by healthcare providers, so in this instance, college students. So my study was trying to do a couple things. The first was to demonstrate like the feasibility and acceptability of using the CBTI app to treat insomnia amongst college students. And the second was to quantify the effectiveness. So when we implement this, when students use it, how good is it at treating the insomnia? And so I hypothesized that our participants, or our students in this case, would have a reduction in insomnia symptoms after participating in 4 weeks of a self-guided treatment. So just a little bit about the method here. So the participants in this study were University of Arkansas students. They were 18 years or older, and they were recruited from their general psychology courses and an online subject database that we use on campus. Students were pre-screened using the Insomnia Severity Index. This is a self-report measure that students filled out. And if their score on that measure was 15 or greater, they were invited to participate in this study. We used a score of 15 because that is sort of the clinically significant score, saying that, okay, they're experiencing symptoms that are severe enough that it may warrant some type of intervention here. So this is what our typical baseline visit looks like. I just want to orient you to a couple things. We won't walk through all of this, but during the baseline visit, I had students download the CBTI Coach app off of whatever sort of app store that they used. The app is completely free. It's also, once downloaded, you can use it without internet, which is really great for accessibility purposes. And you can use it on things like iPads, iPhones, and your computer. I also created an instructional video for students to watch that taught them how to use the app. I had them watch it during this visit so that if they had any initial questions, I could kind of troubleshoot with them in the moment. And then the last thing is the random assignment to treatment or waitlist group. So random assignment is when we are putting participants in one of two groups, not on purpose. We have sort of a system that does it. And what we're trying to do here is create sort of an even distribution of participants. So that's what random assignment means here. Just to sort of orient you guys to what the CBTI Coach app looked like, at the time of the study, this is what the app looked like. There's been some updates since then. But the app has a tools section where they can create, or users can sort of use things like relaxation or ways to reduce caffeine or ways to get out of bed when they're feeling sleepy. There's a learn section that teaches them about sleep and what healthy sleep habits are. And then the last and most important part of the app is the My Sleep section, where people can track their sleep every single day. So what time did they go to bed? What time did they wake up at all during the night, et cetera. And what it does is it graphs it. So we can have a really nice visual representation of what people's sleep looks like over time. So this is just a visual representation of what the study protocol looked like. So at the very top, we have our intervention group, and at the bottom, we have our waitlist group. So at the baseline visit, my intervention group was asked to begin using the CBTI Coach app immediately for 4 weeks, while the waitlist group was instructed just to kind of hang out for 4 weeks. And then at the 4-week period, you can see they kind of flip-flopped here. So then the intervention group was instructed to just kind of hang out for 4 weeks, and the waitlist group was instructed to start using the app for 4 weeks. Every line that you see at week 2, 4, 6, and 8, we collected data from our participants to see how things were going. So the data that I collected was insomnia severity index scores. So this, the self-report measure has 7 items. You measure your symptoms on a 0 to 4 scale, and these are the total score categories. You can notice here that the 15 to 21 is when we start to get into, like I said before, clinical insomnia symptoms that are considered moderate in severity, and then 22 to 28 is clinical insomnia, but we're in the more severe range for severity. So what do we find? So first, I know there's a lot of boxes here. This is a study consort. It basically kind of shows the flow of our participants over the course of our study. So you can see at the very top, we recruited 80 and we put 40 in each group. By week 4, we had lost participants over the 4 weeks for many reasons. So at week 4, we had 27 people in the intervention group and 28 in the waitlist control group. And then by week 8, we had lost a few more people. So we had 24 in the intervention group and 22 in the waitlist control group. So what did we find? So just to orient you here, the dark red bar is our intervention group, while the bright red is going to be our waitlist group. We can see initially at the beginning, at the baseline visit, our intervention group and our waitlist group weren't too far apart in terms of the severity of their insomnia symptoms. So 17.6 to 16.6, they're only about 1 point apart, which means our randomization worked all right. From baseline to week 4, our intervention group was using the app, and we can see that they had a pretty significant reduction in insomnia symptom severity. So 17.6 to 11.8. We also do see a reduction in insomnia symptoms in our waitlist group. It's just not as much as our intervention group. Another little interesting thing to note here is that our intervention group, our dark red, from week 4 to week 8, they had a slight rebound. So they had about a 1 point increase in those following 4 weeks in severity of their insomnia symptoms, whereas our waitlist group continued continued their decrease in insomnia severity while they were engaging with the CBTI Coach app. Another cool thing that we did was we actually asked people about the app itself. So as you can see here, a majority of our participants rated the app as effective, moderately to extremely effective, as you can see here on the very left side. We asked them about the learning materials. Less of our participants found those effective. But then we see that the tools in particular, and compared to the learning materials, so things like relaxation and those types of materials that are available, they found those moderately to extremely effective, a larger percentage of our sample did. So what does this all mean? The self-guided nature of the app can provide an easy and quick access to sort of the core skills that we find in our traditional CBTI. However, it may not be as effective as creating sort of the longer term effects that we typically see in our conventional CBTI treatment. However, the results of the study do support that a self-guided mobile intervention or app for insomnia is acceptable and an effective strategy for treating insomnia symptoms amongst college students. And even more importantly, these findings highlight the utility of disseminating scientifically supported treatment to populations that may be missed by providers, healthcare providers, or other barriers to access. So having interventions that are free and easily accessible to people, we can see that even though they're a little bit different than what we think of traditional intervention, they can still work and they can increase the access that people have to mental health care. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions. this is a chance for you to ask some experts in this field anything that you're wondering or curious about. So we would love if you have a question to step up to the mic and let us hear it.
Hello.
Hi.
Between weeks 4 and 8, why do you think there is a slight uptick in the insomnia index score? I guess the increase slightly of the insomnia symptoms between weeks 4 and 8, when before that there was a decrease.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. So my initial response, or the thing that I would most likely would like to be true, is that the intervention group was no longer using the CBTI Coach app. So at 4 weeks, they were instructed to discontinue using the app from week 4 to week 8. And so they're no longer getting the intervention. So that could be one reason why. Other reasons why could be we're sampling from college students, so the longer that we go into the semester, maybe it's around midterms, and so stress is really high, and so everybody's staying up all night studying for exams. So there's a possible couple things going on, but maybe one of the main things is that they're no longer using the treatment.
Really interesting work. I'm wondering about wearables. So wearables, the Oura Ring, the watches, they're really popular right now. So I'm wondering first, do they interface with your app? And sort of what do you think about that? And I guess related is that some people have sort of a reaction, right? Like they get that self-monitoring can kind of backfire where now I'm kind of preoccupied.
Yes.
So I wonder if you could just kind of speak to the role of wearables.
Yeah, absolutely. So wearables are really a really broad sort of thing, because we have wearables that we use for science, and then we have wearables that are available to everybody. So for example, the Apple Watch that you have, it tracks your sleep for you if you wear it, and it'll give you data. The thing that can be a little bit difficult about that is oftentimes the companies that are using and creating that are not openly sharing the ways in which they're calculating that data. So it's hard for us as scientists to sort of know, like, okay, you're getting this score, or you're saying this thing, but like, how are we actually, you're not sharing with us how you're getting that information. But there are apps that allow you that are a little bit more proactive in the sleep space. They will give you sort of like a sleep score and those types of things. This app in particular, even with the new updates, I'm not aware of that you can sort of sync your information. They've allowed you to download your sleep data off of the app, which was a new sort of feature with the most recent update. So you can kind of use that outside for the purpose of the app. And you're right. We oftentimes see patients that, as they start to see the numbers, so to speak, it's kind of like I'm leveling up, like I need to, my sleep percentage or my sleep score is 50, I want it to be 60, I want to get to 100, even though, that can be really difficult. And so managing those expectations is a really important part of what we do as therapists. And yeah.
Maybe if you don't mind repeating this question so that
Yeah.
people online can hear. So your study focused on college students. Is there anything about college students that makes your findings from your study difficult to translate to, like, say, just that maybe the people watching or other people in the community?
Right. So Harrison's question is sort of orienting to I sampled college students. They were the people who participated in this research. And what about this sample or this population might sort of hinder our ability to generalize these outcomes to the general public? So the first thing that I would say is that college students on average are just a pretty generally healthy group. So you might, as we were talking about sort of access to providers, maybe this is a intervention that's being handed out through medical centers or things like that, right? So inherently, we're starting to bump up against individuals who are having maybe chronic health conditions or things like that, which is not typically what we see within a college population. They're just not as prominent as in the general population. The other thing is that college students are young and they have been brought up using technology. So the idea of trying to sort of teach individuals in the general population about how to use an app-based intervention, we might need to just sort of engage in a little bit more back and forth there. Maybe there needs to be modifications made to an app to better serve a population that we're trying to use this app for. So those are just a couple things that come to mind.
Okay, great. Well, it sounds like this app could still work for a broad range of people. We just may have to think about how it's delivered, and maybe even think about some modifications depending on if the population has more severe insomnia or other health conditions.
Right, and something else too is that oftentimes this is, I didn't create this app. This app is created by the VA and implemented by the VA. And so one of their recent updates was to sort of modify and have some tools and some learning sections for, pregnant individuals. So how does their sleep change specifically? What are some types of things that they can do to modify their behavior for sleep? So they have been taking steps to do that. But yeah.
Okay, great. Any other questions before we move on to our next speaker? I think you've explained it all. So let's give her a hand. Okay, so our next speaker is Marley Fradley. Marley is a third-year clinical psychology doctoral student at the University of Arkansas. Her research interests include exploring the intersections between trauma exposure, post-traumatic stress, and the justice system, and also addressing gaps between evidence-based practice and populations experiencing pressing treatment needs, such as those with justice involvement, housing insecurity, and chronic and acute mental and behavioral health conditions. So please join me in welcoming Marley Fradley.
Hi, everyone. Today we're talking about the elephant in the room and how to leverage integrated behavioral health care to address trauma and PTSD in primary care settings. Okay. Our goals today are to discuss what trauma and PTSD are and why this conversation is important in a healthcare context, to talk a little about what integrated behavioral health care is, examine how common trauma exposure and PTSD symptoms are in patients who are referred for integrated behavioral health care, explore what gaps there are between trauma exposure, PTSD symptoms, and clinical diagnoses related to these things, and then for us to consider how integrated behavioral health care in combination with community engaged research can improve trauma-informed care overall. Okay, so what are we talking about when we bring up trauma and PTSD? So trauma in a clinical setting typically refers to exposure, and that can be direct exposure. It can also be witnessing, or if someone you love experiences something like this. Any events that include actual or threatened death, serious injury, threats to bodily integrity like sexual violence. We also think about things like combat, exposure to a war zone, natural disasters, and extreme accidents like motor vehicle accidents. We know that trauma is relatively common overall across the lifespan, somewhere near 70, maybe a little higher, percent of adults will report at least one traumatic event. We also know that most people recover naturally after experiencing trauma, meaning although the situation might have been difficult, there might have been some symptoms right away or some difficulties immediately after. For most people, that will diminish with time and they'll return back to a more stable baseline. But that is not always the case, and in some situations, people can develop a condition called post-traumatic stress disorder. This condition impacts, I think, between 6 and 10% of people who experience trauma. PTSD is characterized by 4 symptom clusters, we call them. The first one being re-experiencing symptoms, so that looks like intrusive memories, flashbacks, distressing nightmares or bad dreams about trauma. A hallmark of PTSD is also avoidance, so avoiding things that remind someone of what they went through, avoiding people, places, situations. There's also changes in mood and thoughts, so that can be feeling unreasonably negative toward yourself, other people, or the world, having an increase in anxiety or depressive symptoms, having an unreasonable amount of blame or shame for what happened. There's also changes in arousal or reactivity levels, so that can look like an exaggerated startle response, hypervigilance, so an increase in fear, irritability, impulsivity, can also look like sleep disturbance, and difficulties of concentration. So people can experience PTSD in a lot of different ways, and people can also experience parts of that without necessarily meeting the full threshold for diagnosis, but can still be experiencing meaningful difficulties. We know that it is really difficult for people to get access to trauma-focused treatment. And there are a lot of reasons why, many of which Veronica highlighted really well, that it's hard to get access to care in general, but there are specific features of PTSD that can make it especially hard. So that means, there could be stigma or shame related to what this person went through, not to mention that maybe stigma around seeking mental health treatment in the first place. People might not know what kinds of treatments exist that are specific for trauma. They might not know where to find those, even if they have the desire to get them. And then also avoidance, which is a hallmark of PTSD, can make it really hard to take that initial step to getting care. So this brings us to integrated behavioral health. So what is integrated behavioral health care? And I'll probably call this IBHC a lot for this conversation. So this is a type of behavioral health care that is offered directly in medical or primary care settings, which means the same place people go to get their routine medical care, they can also get mental and behavioral health treatment. IBHC tends to take a very holistic or lifespan approach to care. So in the same way you go to get routine annual doctor's visits, IBHC basically suggests that if you go get your mental health checkup every now and then, you might be able to catch things before they get big. So the plus side here is that this allows people to get care really quickly at the same place they're already going, which can take down some of those barriers we talked about and also reduce stigma in general. So this kind of brings us to the point is, can IBHC be used to identify and address trauma-related problems in large populations or in big groups? So we know that primary care is a place where people most often do get care. And so maybe a good example is to think about, let's say somebody goes to their primary care doctor because they're having sleep difficulties. And so maybe that's something that can be treated with a medication or better treated with CBTI. But if this doctor asks the right questions, they might find out that this person's sleep difficulties are related to really distressing trauma-related nightmares. And if this is an integrated behavioral health care practice, that doctor could then refer this patient to somebody who's trained in a trauma-informed intervention that can help this person get access to the kind of care that can support them the most. So this is potential, but that does leave some questions for us as researchers. It's kind of incumbent upon us to prove that this kind of thing can work. So that leads me to the research questions we had, which, how common is trauma in the populations who are maybe getting referred for integrated behavioral health care? Are they also having difficulties related to PTSD or traumatic stress related difficulties? If they're having these problems, are they getting treatment for it, and does it impact how they engage with care? And this is how we answer those questions. We hooked up with 2 different primary care clinics. One of them was a community-based federally qualified health center, so serving a really wide array of people, and the other was a university-based health center. These patients were already getting care there, but whether they self-referred or if a doctor identified them as having a mental or behavioral health problem, they were referred to an in-house behavioral health provider. After patients attended this first appointment, they were asked to complete questionnaires. One of those questionnaires asked about trauma, and then 5 of the most common PTSD symptoms. So that's the PC-PTSD-5. And for the purposes of this study, we consider an elevated PTSD screen to be 3 or more symptoms. So that's what we're kind of counting as possible or probable PTSD in this group of people. They also completed a measure that assessed psychological or emotional distress in general. And then the behavioral health providers themselves recorded notes about who they saw, what their background was, their own diagnostic impressions, so the provider's perception of, hey, what am I treating here? And then we were also able to use those notes to track follow-up visits. So we, as the researchers, were able to link that patient data to the provider's notes and to help us understand who's experiencing trauma, what kind of symptoms do these folks have, what diagnoses are they being recorded as having, and then how did they engage with treatment in general. Ultimately, there are 330 adult primary care patients whose data we were able to use for this study. This is not everybody who our behavioral health providers saw. These are just the folks who filled out those questionnaires. So if a person did not complete those questionnaires, we don't know very much about them, and we're not able to use them in the study. We had 138 patients from the community-based center, 192 from the university-based center. We did some comparisons to see if there were any differences between these groups, and we do know that those in the community tended to be older on average and were more likely to identify as Latino and be racially diverse. All right, so what did we find here? Overall, trauma exposure was common. More than half the entire sample reported exposure to at least one traumatic event. And there was a meaningful difference when we looked at this by clinic. So as you may recall, we're estimating that about 70% of all people might experience trauma. And that is exactly what we saw in our community-based sample. Just about 71% overall reported trauma exposure, but significantly fewer university-based patients reported trauma exposure. And that was even after we accounted for age. So it's not just because they tend to be younger on average and maybe have fewer life experiences overall. When we look at what participants are experiencing, we noted that many patients reported multiple traumatic experiences, and a lot of those events included interpersonal violence, which is person-on-person violence. Regarding symptoms, 63% of all of the trauma-exposed patients in the study had a positive or elevated PTSD screen. So that is really high, considering that in the general population, we might expect less than 10% overall to develop PTSD in the course of their life. And this was pretty similar when we compared community and university at 64 and 60% again. We also noted that aside from just PTSD symptoms, trauma-exposed patients overall had higher levels of psychological distress. So even if PTSD wasn't elevated, and most often it was, they're reporting elevations in other areas too. We also found that trauma was rarely included as part of someone's diagnostic impression, even if they were endorsing elevated symptoms. So just 19% of all trauma-exposed community patients had a diagnosis of either PTSD or something called acute stress disorder, which is kind of a pre-PTSD diagnosis, and just 9% of trauma-exposed university patients. And remember, that's compared to 60 and 64% of patients saying, yes, I am having these problems. We also learned that for some patients, trauma was associated with how they engaged with care, but only for certain ones. So for university-based patients who did have trauma exposure, they actually tended to have more follow-up visits compared to other groups of people. Okay, so what does it all mean? So just to summarize, we learned that trauma exposure is very common here in patients who are getting support for behavioral health in primary care settings. We also learned that these trauma-exposed patients are having significant trauma-related symptoms as well as just high psychological distress overall. And we're seeing that trauma is very rarely recognized in these patients' diagnostic impressions, which suggests to us that it might not be coming up in session, so that's the elephant in the room. It tells us that there might be a gap between what patients are showing up with, what they're experiencing, and then what's being recognized in care. So if it's not coming up, then they're not being treated for it. We also learned here that trauma-exposed university patients overall attended more follow-up appointments. So on one hand, this might be telling us that, yes, like people who have greater need are showing up for care, but it also might suggest that patients going to this university clinic might have fewer barriers to care than those in the community. If you think about it proximally, the university clinic is embedded where many patients who consist of students, staff, and faculty live and work, so there are fewer barriers overall to getting there. What this data implies is that if trauma comes up, there is an opportunity to not only receive trauma-informed care, so to be treated respectfully and with respect to your own life experiences, but also to get access to evidence-based treatments for PTSD, many of which we know at this point can be effectively administered in primary care settings. We know that trauma recognition is going to be really important to expanding access to care and trying to meet that gap where people who experience trauma and related symptoms are not getting treatment. And I want to emphasize that screening is a necessary part of this process, but as this data shows, it's really not enough. People are willing to say if they're having difficulties, but if they're not being asked about it in session and if they're not being treated for it, then we as providers are not meeting that need effectively. And then on a final note, I just want to highlight why this kind of research and engagement is so important. So we wouldn't know any of this if we didn't have partnerships with the clinics we got this data from, and if the patients there did not agree to participate and share their information and experiences with us. When the general public chooses to participate in research, it can help us understand their experiences, it can help us identify these kinds of gaps in care, and can help us make better decisions when we're designing healthcare and designing interventions for people. But that is all. Thank you. What kinds of questions?
That was a great talk. Anybody have a question for us to start us off?
Hi, Marley. I have a bit of a question. So you mentioned that patients are often more willing to discuss traumatic experiences than providers, or maybe recognizing or like noting in their diagnostic impressions. What do you attribute that to? Do you think it's lack of expertise in PTSD? Do you think it's discomfort in discussing those kind of experiences? Like what would you speculate there?
I think that's tricky to speculate, but what I can say is that the providers who kept these notes are all people who are trained in trauma-informed interventions. So it is not at least a knowledge issue in this moment. There could be a lot of factors coming into play, and some of them could be patient level. So it could be that maybe it takes time to build up enough trust to disclose that I've had these events, I'm having these difficulties. From a provider perspective, integrated behavioral health care can be really fast-paced. Sometimes you only have 30 minutes or 20 minutes even to see a patient. And so I can't imagine that there are situations in which there could be some hesitancy to ask a question that might yield an emotional or lengthy response if you feel like you don't have the time to address it properly. But that being said, the cost is that the patient's needs are not being met. Thank you.
Anybody else have a question for Marley?
What's the timeline? So do they fill out a packet of questionnaires kind of at baseline? Because I'm wondering of the opposite, and that is, I'm here because I have an earache, and now you're bringing up this really painful experience. Can you talk a little bit about how the timing works and whether there are sort of individual differences in whether patients are willing to talk about it kind of when asked?
Yeah, so generally speaking, patients are asked to fill this questionnaire out right at the end of their initial behavioral health visit, which most often is not being scheduled on the same day that they are being identified as being in need of the behavioral health service. So there is something called a warm handoff in which a patient who has an ear infection identifies that they're also having a mental health problem, in which a behavioral health provider could then pop into the room and kind of check in with them. That does happen, but it didn't happen very much in this study. So most often people are getting referred and then they have a designated appointment to discuss their behavioral health difficulties, in which presumably they might expect these types of questions. But very good question.
Marley, I have a question. So this, you bring up this point of that, trauma is often very hard to bring up and for patients, and this is something that often has a lot of stigma and sometimes felt avoidance for even bringing it up. But there's also an obligation on the receiver end for providers to know what to do with that or even ask about it. So I wonder what both people in the community and providers could do to kind of like smooth this pathway of communication. You've talked about it some, but I wonder if you have any other ideas.
As in how to respond?
Yeah, to respond or to even maybe for people who are not sure how to bring it up to their provider. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah. Well, I think something to think about is to remember how incredibly common it is to experience a traumatic event. And I think it's really powerful to recognize or to maybe learn through experiences of sharing that you're not alone in what you've been through, and even that you might not be alone in the difficulties that you're experiencing. Because as we saw with this data, it's really common to experience difficulties in some populations. I think as like people, when somebody chooses to share with us, I consider that I feel pretty grateful in those moments because I recognize that that's not easy. And I feel like it's an opportunity, to show that person wow, I do care about your experiences. I do care that this is something that you went through, whether or not I can necessarily relate to it. And I think that's maybe the most important thing to think about is just what does it mean to show up for someone and let them know that their experiences matter to you? I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, well, I think that's a philosophy that a lot of providers and patients can take is that this is really normal. And then when it's brought up, that the least that we can do as providers and people of the community is to meet it with, open arms. So, anybody else have a question? I actually have one more. Because this work is really interesting, and it seems like it's really intensive. Like it took a lot of time and energy. So I wonder if you could just talk about, for the people who are not involved in research, what is it like to do this? Like, how long does it take? How did you convince people to do this? How did you get their data? I wonder if you could talk about that, some of the logistics.
Sure. Yeah, I think I neglected to say, so there were 330 patients that we were able to include in the analyses that we ran for this. And those patient data were collected between August 2022 and August 2025. So it took 3 years to collect 330 patient encounter or first visit patient encounters. So that's one every 3 days. It takes a long time to get this data. And because a lot of people decline, or we might lose data, or data might be, people might fill it out the wrong way. So there's a lot of things that can happen that make the data unusable, and it's just hard to gather in the first place. People are often hesitant sometimes too to share about their experiences, what is this for? Who's going to see this? Who's going to use that? And rightfully so. I think as researchers, we have an obligation to be really open and transparent with our patients or our research participants about why are we collecting this data? What do we use it for? What does it mean when they choose to share it with us? And I know I have this personal experience. I actually know you both do too because of your clerkship placements, that, asking patients to fill this out, sometimes it does feel like a burden because you're asking them oh gosh, we just had this 30-minute session where, we kind of speed ran therapy, and now I'm and fill out this questionnaire, please, and I've got someone coming in the door. So I think as researchers and clinicians, it's necessary for us to make sure that we're slowing down with our patients to explain to them what this data is for, why we're asking them to fill it out, because that way they understand that they're a key stakeholder, then there's some buy-in. Yeah, it is really tricky to get this kind of community-engaged research, and that's why I was trying to emphasize the importance of community collaboration at the end too.
So what I'm hearing is that it takes a long time, but also that it's also okay to slow down and explain to people why this research is important, because a big part of it is that they have the right to make a decision. So it's slow, but we also need to slow down. Yeah.
It can happen fast.
Yeah. Well, let's give Marley a big hand. Okay, our third and final speaker, last but not least, is Dr. Mitch Brown. Dr. Brown is an instructor and researcher of psychological science at the University of Arkansas and is director of the Social Perception and Human Evolutionary Research Lab. He earned his PhD in experimental psychology at the University of Southern Mississippi in 2019 and has been in Fayetteville since 2020. His research interests focus on the evolutionary nature of social perceptions with a focus on mate preferences and men's formidability. More recent endeavors have seen him start to address censorship in academic research and how to navigate polarizing conversations while maintaining free speech. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mitch Brown.
Hi, everybody. That's me on the screen right there. Let's go ahead and get started. So today's talk today is going to be one investigating some research I've been doing since graduate training. A lot of this work has primarily covered the idea that when we view somebody's face, we oftentimes make incredibly strong judgments about what their personality is, various traits of who they are, and sometimes there may be some very notable and sometimes even serious downstream consequences for these inferences that may actually lead to a series of maybe unfair stereotypes for which no kernels of truth may exist. So really, a lot of our discussion here today can focus pretty readily on the notion of, what actually, how do we infer information about someone? How, with very limited time to interact with someone, oftentimes throughout our evolutionary histories, interactions would be very, very quick, because oftentimes that could sometimes have been a matter of life and death. How are we actually inferring quite a bit of social information in someone just so quickly? The thing is, we do this, through myriad channels, and this is oftentimes to be in the service of cooperation, because historically, cooperation was a critical portion of human survival. And in turn then, through this cooperation, this required fairly effective communication between other people within one's social groups. And if we're going to cooperate, we have to be able to look at someone and be able to infer their intentions pretty quickly. We would have to be able to communicate our intentions to others too. And there appears to be one way through which this can occur pretty easily. And for humans, just given the fact that, we evolved to be straight upright, looking straight ahead, there's this wonderful thing that we see right in front of us, the face, one of these kinds of things. It appears that this is a fairly robust social stimulus from which we can actually infer quite a bit of information. So faces are very useful, again, for this information, and from them we can actually start to infer another person's intentions, their abilities for various tasks within living in a group, and from there, actually, we start to make very strong inferences. And again, this is all, the reason why this is occurring is because throughout our evolutionary history, there's been a strong importance of face-to-face contact. The idea here being that you're looking straight ahead, you need to be able to look at someone, figure out, with very limited information, how can they potentially help us? How can they potentially harm us? Everything kind of in between. What are the goals of this person, and how may they potentially jive with my goals myself as another social group member? And sometimes when we're making these inferences, we are sometimes using strong emotional displays. Sometimes we're simply looking at somebody's face to see, are they happy, are they angry, and there appears to be a relatively universal facial expression for these features, but also with these emotional displays, they take a bit of time to extrapolate from. Oftentimes there is a degree of ambiguity with them. Sometimes we have fake emotions. Some of you in the room have probably laughed at a really bad joke just to be polite. Ha ha ha, go away now. That notion of the fake smile. So with that, in that instance, emotional displays in the face, they may be very reliable, but also they may be a bit imperfect. What may be a bit resistant to this faking, what may be more resistant to possible false signaling, instead of simply relying entirely on these kinds of emotional displays, we may actually be using facial features that could be a bit more static, things that may be a bit more innate, things that are a bit harder to fake, and for the most part here, we tend to make these inferences, through facial features to infer quite a bit about someone's overall social value within a group. Historically, this could have been, again, a matter of life and death. In a modern context, maybe not as severe, but at the same time, though, we may be in a situation where we can figure out how somebody may fit in a broader tapestry of social living. So in today's talk, I will be discussing this primarily from the standpoint of men's facial structure, and I'll be navigating this through basically how do we infer perceptions of men as fathers? What facial features do we use to infer men's paternal abilities? And ultimately, what specific features are central to this inference? So in our case here, when it comes to paternal stereotyping, oftentimes we can think about it from the standpoint of, well, mate selection primarily. So historically, women's mate selection has relied pretty heavily on identifying men who may have been capable of providing strong paternal care. And the thing is, this actually is a pretty unique thing for humans as a species. Various other non-human primates don't have nearly the level of paternal investment that we do in our own offspring, actually. Potentially because of the fact that humans are born relatively weak and underdeveloped. Oftentimes, biparental investment was historically a way to make sure that the infant could survive long enough in adulthood. So basically, having two parents of some capacity. So for a lot of women trying to identify a viable mate, the thought is, how good of a dad is he going to be? And sometimes one of the more central aspects of this paternal inference is how protective is he going to be of our offspring? How is he going to protect our offspring from danger? And this then becomes incumbent upon perceivers then to figure out, who actually would be, good at providing this paternal care. Oftentimes, actually, when it comes down to it, how do we infer men's parental ability pretty heavily? Turns out, cues to men's formidability, their ability to win fights, their physical strength, their physical prowess. Turns out, features connoting this formidability appear to be rather central to these inferences. So, oftentimes, we tend to infer people's, intentions through their appearance. Either this could be accurate, so there are various kernels of truth in the way we're inferring information about another person, or sometimes actually instead, this is a matter of stereotyping, something for which the kernel of truth may not be as obvious. And for the most part here, we tend to use physical formidability, this prowess, as a central tenet for perceptions of men's protective ability. That being said, though, as we're trying to infer men's overall protective ability through their formidability, we also may be inferring some downstream consequences that are a bit more negative. So with protective capability, we may also be inferring aggressive intention. So as we're inferring the possible protective role of formidable men in group living, we may also be inferring the possible costs of the so-called bully of the environment. So how are perceivers navigating this possible cost-benefit analysis to figure out who would be a good person with whom I can interact or who could potentially be an optimal father in some instances? So for a lot of these inferences that we're discussing here today with formidability, one of the more central features to infer men's prowess actually could be a feature known as their facial width to height ratio. So overall here, just wanted to show you guys in just like the most broad of strokes possible. I have two faces on the screen here. So this guy here in red, this is an individual who has what's known as a high facial width to height ratio. Guy in blue, what's known as a low facial width to height ratio. And for the most part here, whether you have a high or a low ratio, this actually informs various perceptions that we have downstream. But also, interestingly enough, there appear to be some kernels of truth to it. So overall, actually, men with high ratios, they tend to actually be better fighters, and this is across various weight classes. So oftentimes, for the most part, in MMA, men with these higher ratios, they tend to have better win-loss records. They tend to be better grapplers. They can throw it around a little bit. On Austin 316 Day, that's pretty terrific, actually. March 16th, people, get some culture. But as we progress a bit further here, this high ratio, this inference of formidability, there appears to be a bit of a connection here with the fact that some of these features actually would have historically advantaged men in physical conflict. Turns out some of these features are kind of based in the fact that some men have higher levels of prenatal testosterone, various forms of puberty-based surges of testosterone in their body that actually would result in a higher ratio in their face, actually. And for the most part here, as we're inferring, fairly accurately men's prowess, we also are stereotyping them to have certain benefits for us living in a group. We tend to view these men as good protectors. We tend to view these men as fairly good at protecting us against threats from other groups. We view these guys as pretty good for games of tug of war, possibly for a football team. And we also view them as actually motivated to protect children, these high ratio men. That said, though, high ratio men seem to have various costs associated with them too. And again, these are purely stereotypes. There is actually no kernel of truth to this. We tend to perceive these men as very prone to anger. We tend to view these men as less intelligent. We tend to view these men as incapable of doing complex tasks. In the field, we call that dehumanization. So we tend to view these individuals as less human if they have a wider face. But also, too, again, these stereotypes don't have much of a kernel of truth to them. So with this in mind here, my research pivoted to discuss the standpoint of how could men's facial width to height ratio actually inform perceptions of them as parents overall? Or more importantly, so I've talked about the protector role of a high ratio man. What about the potential role as the bully? So maybe we also have these concomitant, these co-occurring perceptions of formidable men as disciplinarians as parents. Potentially, do we view them as fathers who may be more likely to punish their offspring? So seeing both a cost and a benefit for someone based on social living. So in this case, I conducted 4 experiments for us to consider how these kinds of stereotypes can emerge based on men's faces. So for the first study, I predicted that men with high ratios would be perceived as more disciplinarian toward their offspring. In study 2, I wanted to consider, is this because we view these men as stronger or angrier? So we considered 2 possible perceptions that could be the basis for this inference. Then study 3, are these stereotypes specific to a kind of discipline? And then study 4, more seriously, is there an actual downstream inference that could have an implication for a modern context? So we evolved to make these kinds of stereotypes. How do these stereotypes actually lead to various forms of unfair systemic biases, actually? So first of all, is there a stereotype? So I conducted 2 studies here first, in which I presented participants. These were undergrads at U of A, various faces. Some of these faces were of men with a high ratio, whereas some of these men had a low ratio. And they evaluated the 10 high, 10 low for both studies. And then for the first study, I ultimately tasked participants to say, how likely is this person to punish their offspring? Scale of 1 to 7. 1, not at all. 7, very much. And also what I found was that high ratio men were perceived indeed as more likely to punish their offspring relative to low ratio men. And then for study 2, I want to do a little bit of replication in the world of social psychology. We love replication. I also want to consider what is the basis of this perception of punishment? Is this because we perceive these men as strong? Is it because we perceive them as anger? Or maybe it's both. So I did the exact same study again, but I added 2 extra questions. How angry does this person look to be? And how strong does this person look to be? And overall, we replicated the basic fact. High ratio men seen as more likely to punish than low ratio men. And we also view these men as more likely to commit a much more severe punishment with an extra question. And also, too, interestingly enough, high ratio men also seen as angrier and stronger. And now you don't necessarily need to worry too much about all the numbers on the screen right here, but essentially what we found overall was that individuals with a higher ratio were, again, perceived as stronger and angrier. These perceptions of anger and strength were actually, both predictive of a greater likelihood that a man would punish, a high ratio man would punish his offspring. But in this case here, it looks like the effect is much much bigger for anger overall. And then when it comes to the severity of the punishment, the effect is especially driven by how angry these men are actually, or at least perceptions of them. So as we want to move a bit further, the next question then becomes: is there a specific kind of punishment that we're stereotyping high ratio men as committing versus others? So basically, is this proclivity toward punishment? Is this specific maybe to something more corporal like spanking? Or is this a more general stereotype that may include more gentle forms of discipline, like talking it out or having a conversation with your kids? Use your words, guys. So in that scenario, I used the very similar paradigm for the first 2 studies, the exact same 10 faces again. But I basically asked them, I asked participants, again, U of A students, to indicate the extent to which they would use both harsh and gentle parenting strategies. And what I found overall, graph didn't come out that well. That's all right. I should have noticed that ahead of time. But basically, what we ultimately found was that high ratio men, so these men with these formidable-looking faces, we perceive them as especially prone to using aggressive parenting styles, aggressive disciplinarian styles. Whereas for individuals with a low ratio, we view them as more likely to use a gentle parenting style, a more gentle disciplinary approach. So in that case here, it appears that these stereotypes tend to be very domain specific. And then we move our attention to study 4. This one is kind of less cute as the previous 3 studies. This one does have some more real world implications that can highlight various systemic issues that could be emerging because of the fact that human evolution did not necessarily consider the legal system and the U.S. Constitution in its development that could actually impede fair treatment for people. So basically, the question here is: do these evolved perceptions map onto expectations of men as being more abusive toward their children? So in this study, I had participants evaluate the exact same 20 faces, but with one single question: how likely is this person to commit child abuse? Actually. And what we found overall, high ratio men were perceived as more likely to commit child abuse compared to low ratio men. However, though, and this is an important caveat, neither category of ratio, so high and low, they were never seen as categorically more likely to commit abuse. Just relatively to commit more prone to abuse among high ratio men compared to low ratio. So even though we see a relative vulnerability to these behaviors, no one is viewed as categorically abusive in this sample, thankfully. And just some general discussion points here. Perceivers typically do regard formidable men as harsh disciplinarians. We tend to view them as more likely to engage in more hostile, more aggressive forms of parenting. And this may be part of our broader picture here of considering both the costs and benefits of men throughout group living. And it's interesting enough, both men and women were perceiving these faces similarly to each other. So maybe women could have been considering this from the standpoint of who could possibly help or harm my offspring, and maybe the same thing for men too. Who may be more who could be safer to be around for my own children. Now the thing is here, there actually is still a degree of kernel of truth. We tend to be pretty accurate at inferring some information in men's faces based on their structures, but also too, how much of this is a mismatch from our ancestral environments? So are we relying on these stereotypes broadly to understand men's behavior? If we are, but also too, is it always appropriate to apply it in different domains? Is it actually appropriate for us in a legal or maybe a medical setting to infer somebody's intentions based solely on their appearance rather than using diagnostic criteria? To me, that sounds a bit inappropriate, actually. So I'm actually now in the process here of trying to understand how can we help clinicians, people in the legal system, how can we help them overcome these possible biases here, especially in men's faces, so that way they may not be as prone to making these kinds of threat responses. Also, some subsequent research I'm considering this with here too. So these stimuli here I used today these are all primarily white faces. I've been conducting research considering various ethnic categories to figure out whether some of these inferences may have some kind of racialized component to them. Results are pretty promising, and I'm also trying to apply this to very specific legal domains. So just going to close out here. I just want to acknowledge my wonderful co-authors on these projects and give you some information on where you can find my stuff online. And I open the floor up for questions. I'm not afraid.
One taker here.
Yep.
Hey, Mitch.
Hello.
The second set of faces that you put up, it seemed like the guy on the right was quite a bit younger than the guy on the left, or at least it appears that way. I was wondering if you made any efforts to standardize the high versus low height to width ratio, man, just to see if it wasn't a perception of their age.
Oh, 100%, yeah. So it was less so about, I love that question. So it wasn't, these faces were of men who were between ages 18 to 30 primarily. But yeah, the low ratio guy does look younger, but also too, that's still a bit of a confound with low ratios anyway. Just broadly speaking, men with less formidable faces, they tend to look younger. But at the same time though, I do have a wider range of ages within the low ratio faces to where a lot of our low ratio men do look more, so I guess you could say age appropriate. I wanted to, with that slide in particular, I wanted to provide the most salient example of a high versus low to show you what that could potentially look like. But yeah, I did have a pretty good age representation within that category of high and low ratio people. That's a good question. Hello.
I'm more curious. I'm not sure how to word the question, but I guess over the last century or so, maybe in your research, is there, I guess, a gravitational shift, or what traits are some becoming more predominant than others? Are we seeing more, I guess, higher ratio faces increasing or are lower? Is there a trend in, I guess, evolutionary traits? What's, I guess, to meet the needs of our society in the modern day?
Yeah, no, you worded that question very well. So I would say over the past century, it's probably not going to be as poignant, as salient, but just because it's just such a small scale in the grand scheme of human evolution. But at the same time, though, some features do actually vacillate in terms of their overall social desirability based on certain contexts, actually. So in some parts of the world, actually, let's give you an example of from one study, Colombia. There tend to be relatively higher rates of intimate partner violence in Colombia relative to other South American countries. And what we actually see is that in those environments where there could be high rates of partner violence, there tends to be a downshift for women's interest in men with masculine faces, actually, because women may be heuristically seeing the costs of those faces much more so than the supposed benefits of that, actually. So so even if there's not necessarily like a change in structures that based on a time scale, what actually is being chosen, what may be more desirable in those environments, they actually do change based on environmental cues. So sometimes we have concerns of intimate partner violence, as I mentioned, sometimes the levels of disease in your environment, sometimes access to resources. And some of these structures here, actually, they're part of like a broader idea of facial masculinity. Like people will vacillate. They will change their preference for masculine structures based on what kinds of environmental pressures are just much more apparent at one time versus another.
Any other questions from the audience for Mitch? I have one.
Sure.
You mentioned that maybe some cultural and I'm guessing also some kind of like geopolitical differences in those in Colombia. But I wonder if you could speak to any other like cultural differences that you may have found or other people have found in this work.
Yeah. So broadly speaking here, so I can say that there's a universal perception of high ratio men as angrier and stronger. So that is, a much more universal thing. But also in some other contexts, actually. So maybe kind of like this broader construct of masculinity in the face. We actually see, at least among the Maasai people of East Africa, they actually have a reduced perception of hostility in a higher ratio of faces, actually. So I'm not necessarily sure what the broader cultural context of that could ultimately be, but the heads of people tend to downplay perceptions of anger in these kinds of faces overall. Other aspects of this too, actually. So because I was using primarily white male stimuli with predominantly white culture, some of these stereotypes may not necessarily generalize in some domains, but I can actually say in some domains they kind of get more culturally specific. So as an example, when we're considering East Asian men in these studies here, there actually is a nice little cross-section between the racialized stereotypes and those related to masculinity, to where men with lower ratios who are also East Asian, we tend to view these individuals as embodying a very onerous, unfortunate stereotype of being the so-called tiger parent, where we tend to stereotype East Asian fathers as more authoritarian, but also that's an authoritarianism that appears to be specific to so-called low ratio strategies, which would be along the lines of just more instrumental or strategic aggression. So there are some sometimes the cultural differences based on the target will do certain thing. Sometimes the culture of the perceiver will do certain things. But even though there's a degree of universality, like just the awareness of these cultural stereotypes could actually start to make these shifts happen.
That's fascinating. Looks like we have one more
terrific
question from the audience.
Hi, Mitch.
Hello.
So for people who may not be so familiar with this, could you please explain how you compile the images of the faces that you showed?
Absolutely not. Thank you for asking that. So essentially, these are faces that exist in a norm stimulus set. So this is part of what's known broadly as the Chicago Faces database. So these are individuals who who came to a lab about a decade ago, and they told them put on the standardized gray shirt, so there's no bias here. So that in that instance, they have everyone get their picture taken straight on. And among these individuals, there were multiple categories of people, and within these categories, actually, what I did was I chose individuals who scored the highest and the lowest ratios for those specific groups of people, actually. So what you're seeing on the screen here is I chose the 10 highest and the 10 lowest people in that database. In this case here for white men, but I have every other collected ethnic category for men and women here. So that way I have these compiled and ready to go. Fun fact, actually, these perceptions are specific to men's faces, and they don't show up for women's faces.
This is fascinating work. Everybody give Mitch a hand. Great job. So we have a few more minutes, and I don't want to keep everybody too much longer, but I was hoping to ask some of the panelists here a few questions about kind of what it's like to do research, at least partially for a living. So I wonder if I don't know if y'all's mics are working, so we may have to pass this one around.
Already
But-
mic'd up.
Okay, nice. Mitch is mic'd up. So I wonder if one or multiple of you could speak to some of the main challenges of doing research.
I think one of the things is that for all of the studies that were presented today, there's decisions that need to be made at every single point of a research process. So it is the question that you want to ask: who are we trying to ask this for? What types of measures are we going to use? Sometimes it's like, what kind of pencils do we have available for people? Or, so there's like really, I think that there's oftentimes, we think of research as like these really big, broad processes, and that does happen, but oftentimes it's being like propelled by these much more nuanced sort of decisions.
Is it safe to say that what you see up here is a very polished version of, sometimes, like Marley said, years of work of maybe deciding what pencil to use? Not saying that takes years, but tons of design considerations, and so a lot of times what the public may see is this really refined version in a journal or a news article, but it sounds like it's really, really grueling and sometimes very time intensive.
Yeah, and to add to that, it's a ton of ongoing problem solving, one thing after the next. Any kind of work, there's always problems that come up, like, oh, we got 100 pencils that broke. Like, now we have to replace those pencils. Or in work, like, oh, we don't have time to have someone sit down and fill out a paper survey. We need to create a digital version that people can scan on their phones, and we need to extend the window of time in which they can complete the survey. So there are tons of problems too that get addressed and solved in the moment, and it is impossible to predict every problem that will arise in a research project.
One thing that I'd like to point out too with this all is like the idea of research broadly. It's important to remember too that oftentimes science is a very incremental, iterative process. A lot of people, when they first start doing science, they say, "Oh, I want to research this topic broadly," but sometimes there's not necessarily that focus yet. Oftentimes, when people are getting the science disseminated to them, so after the sausages are made proverbially, you oftentimes get a nice product here that's titrated to one very specific question. I run into this issue a lot of times with my undergrads, actually, where they want to study a big topic, but also too they don't really understand just how big that topic actually is. So I have to use a metaphor for them, saying, let's not drink the ocean. It's just a very broad strokes approach to how everything kind of is existing. That's great. We can understand this rich tapestry, but also too, we need to take that straw and put it in a single cup and go from there, and just recognize that every little incremental contribution that you're making to science, it will count. Science it's a team effort. You're contributing to that team. No study will ever be perfect, and it's oftentimes just important to remember the fact that science, is just a lot of little pieces coming together.
Again, I'm hearing that science is slow.
Yes.
Good science is slow.
Good science is slow. Just to wrap this up, I wonder if y'all could speak to, people in the audience or listening online, whoever watches this video. Science is out there. It is disseminated. It is published in journals and news articles on TikTok and social media. There's no shortage of the flow of information. But what we're at this point in time, it's really an issue of how do we discern what is legit, and how do we make sense of that, and how do we become advocates for ourselves, like some of your studies as how do we make sure we get the care we need based on this science that we see. So I wonder if y'all could talk about the steps people can make to be more comfortable doing that.
I think to be a critical consumer of science, you also, in some ways, have to be a scientist yourself. And I mean that, like, as scientists, when we read something, just because it says this is true or this is what's happening, oftentimes we just don't look at that one thing. We have to say, okay, I need to look at the opposite, or like where's more evidence to support this thing. And I think that is true whenever we are seeing science come to us through TikTok or on the news or anything like that. We have to be critical, and we also have to sort of amass and continue to look for and follow up on. And I think that's a process that we have to engage in.
So what I'm hearing is that everyone needs to be some version of a scientist themselves. So to be curious, to be critical, and to also weigh the fact that one study is one study, and that almost nothing's been proved by one study.
Well, you can't even say prove it. Anyway, proof is for math.
Yeah, that's right. I'm even messing up here.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is when you're hearing about things, consider, science rarely deals in absolutes. Nothing is usually ever one way all of the time. And so if there's information being presented to you in that way, I would be highly skeptical of that.
Sometimes it's best just to sit in that discomfort almost, where just realistically, there are going to be a lot of studies that could support one claim, but then also, as you're mentioning, the refutations. One thing that's just helped me throughout my career as a scientist was making sure that I don't necessarily marry one of my pet theories, making sure that I don't necessarily become so enwrapped with one set of ideas that I just become entirely blinded to possible disconfirmatory evidence, to make sure that I'm always recognizing that stuff's messy, and learning how to sit with that uncertainty sometimes which is not necessarily conducive to a lot of everyday life where we have to make very big decisions, but also to learning how to sit with uncertainty has been very, very helpful for me as a scientist.
A good life lesson, sitting with uncertainty.
And ask questions. Like that's what we do. That's what consumers should do, is ask the question. Even if you have to ask the question to multiple people in different ways, it is you continuing to gather information, and that's what the process is about.
Absolutely. Anybody else got anything to add to that? I think we covered it all. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks so much for joining us online, and we'll have another talk next month. And I forgot the date, but it's going to be on stress and decision making. So please join us for that. Thanks so much.